verse 12, if that's okay. This is 1 to 12.
For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But even after we had suffered before, and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who tests our hearts. But neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So, affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labour and toil, for labouring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory.
Thank you, Neil. I thought it'd be good. We started 1 Thessalonians last week on the contact group, and we looked at chapter 1, but I thought I'd just give a little bit of background to the toings and froings, the movements that went on with Paul and his fellow workers there. Do you want to pull yourself back a bit, or are you all right there? You're fine there, eh? Like as if you're on a bus by there now. There we are. I thought I'd just have a look at the toing and froings of the Paul, Silas and Timothy, just to give a background on how we've come with this first letter to the Thessalonians. Probably the first New Testament letter that's been written and recorded. It was written before the Gospels, it was written before any of the letters that Paul wrote. It's the earliest that we have of the church and its foundation in Christ. And so Paul, in Acts 17, which gives us the background to the letter being written, Paul and Silas leave Thessalonica in the early hours of the morning, under the cover of darkness, we're told in Acts 17, because the situation had become so bad there. Jason, a new convert, had been bound over. That means he had to pay up money up front to promise that there would be good behaviour, and this the problems that the new Christians were causing, or Paul was causing, would come to an end. And so he had to pay a fine. And on that account, Paul decided that it was best for him to leave. And so he and Silas, we are told, leaves. Nothing is mentioned of Timothy, so we can assume from later writings that he gives us that Timothy stayed in Thessalonica to strengthen the new converts. Moving to Berea, the next city down in Macedonia, we find Paul and Silas go there, and the same success that they knew in Thessalonica is found in Berea. Tremendous results were taking place there as they're preaching the gospel. But the problem was that some of the troublemakers that had organized some of the riots that went on in Thessalonica because of Paul's preaching had followed him down to Berea. And so again, he's forced to leave. The new Christians there urge him to leave, and he seems to have left Silas in Berea. He moves on, because it says in Acts 17, he moved on and sailed south then towards Athens in southern Greece. Now these people had been following him, and he gets to Athens, and he writes a message back to Silas and Timothy for them to join him as soon as they possibly can. Now, 1 Thessalonians 3 suggests that Timothy got to him before he left Athens. He got back to him. And so we find there, but then he moves on from Athens after preaching in the city there, not with the same measure of success. We find Paul in there speaking in the marketplace and then going up to Mars Hill where all the great intellectuals were, and they laugh at him, they mock him because he preaches about the resurrection from the dead. But Paul, even there in such circumstances, still finds people coming to Christ. He's not able to establish a church there, but certainly he's able to find new converts for Christ there. And so he comes down to Corinth. By Corinth, or by the time he's come to Corinth, both Timothy and Silas have joined with him. And he's received this report that Timothy has given. He's told him both good news and bad news. Chapter 1, we looked at the good news last week. Their receptivity, their reception of the gospel, their receptivity towards God, his word, his messengers. And Paul was so thrilled with it all, and he wanted just to encourage them. He said, do you realize the changes that went on in Thessalonica in such a short period of time? The news of that has spread throughout all Macedonia. It's come down into Achaia, north and southern Greece, really. That's what he's talking about. But he said, news of what's been going on amongst you as a fellowship, it's spreading through all the Roman provinces. And so Paul writes this letter, and he encourages them in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is like listening to one side of a telephone call, because he's there whilst in his absence. Timothy has told him the bad news as well. Some of those troublemakers have called to question Paul's character, his integrity, and they challenge the believers there. Say, look, this man here, this is the man that was in prison in Philippi and had to leave that city. When he came to Thessalonica and he preached here, when the pressure increased to such an extent, he's done a runner again. And news, no doubt, had reached as well that when he left to Berea and had to leave Berea, this is a man that can't cope with pressure. But Paul says, no, in verse 2 he says, we were bold in our God. We were bold. It infers there that he had a tremendous sense of liberty preaching the gospel. There are times when you can witness, there are times when you can preach, when there is a tremendous liberty. And you're able to share and reach into the hearts of those around us. And that's what Paul experienced in the capital city of Macedonia, Thessalonica. He found a tremendous liberty to preach the gospel. And even though the conflict was rising higher and higher, the thought that, well, when I preached like this in Philippi, they beat me. When I preached like this in Philippi, they threw me into prison and finally threw me out of the city. Did he change his style? Did he change his method? No, he remained bold in the gospel. And so he preached with tremendous liberty there. And he referred them back to what happened in Philippi and says, no, I argue this point. And so this accusation has come forth, and I insist upon this. We were bold in our God. In verse 4, he goes on to say that we were approved of God. If you've got your authorized version, it uses the words, we were allowed of God. And so God had entrusted them with the gospel, and they were allowed or approved of God. They were questioning his motives. The A-listers, the Hollywood starlets of Paul's day, were the orators that went from city to city. They were the highest paid people in the dramatic arts then, if you want. They were the people that could earn big money. And if you remember when he was in Corinth, there were those that says, well, look, he don't even charge for preaching. He can't be that good an orator if he's not going to even charge you. And so Paul had to wrestle with different arguments, and supremely it was his motives that were being tested. It was his character, his integrity. This man is in it for what he can get out of it. But Paul says, no, we were approved of God. We were approved. He writes of Apollos, doesn't he, his friend in Rome, and he says, greet Apollos in Christ, approved in Christ, he says. And that means Apollos was a believer that had gone through a tremendous test of faith and had come through victorious. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't come through with wounds or with everything else or without wounds. It means that he came through the test and he bore the mark of Christ upon him. He was approved of God. Paul had the same problem down in Galatia. The first churches that he opened, We find there in Galatia, he said, look, if I seek to please men, if I'm there just to please men, I cannot be the servant of Christ. And so Paul is always under this pressure. He says in Corinthians that the care of the churches was upon him daily, but there was another pressure that was upon him, a divine pressure that was constantly, in verse 4 he tells us, was testing his motives. Why are you doing what you're doing? And so Paul, he says, listen now, I'm under divine pressure here, when he is questioning, not just you, but he is testing my motives as to why I do what I do. And I bear the mark of God's approval upon me. So we were bold in our God. We were approved of God. But this man is hard. He's harsh. He's got strict new rules that we've never come across before. He challenges the Thessalonians in so many ways about work, about the way that the women were treated in the city. And so there were still problems in the way that women were treated after Paul had left Thessalonica. And after he'd written the first letter, there were still problems there. And he questioned certain things. But Paul brought in these new ideas, new rules, that were so different to what the world knew at that time. When they said of Jesus, when he spoke, we've never heard a man speak like this before, to bring in thoughts that we never even thought of before. Paul was of the same ilk. And he said, look, I wasn't harsh. We were gentle among you. Even as a nursing mother, we were gentle. 1 Thessalonians is probably one of the most warm, personable, affectionate letters that Paul has ever penned. You compare it to Galatians, it is completely different. You find with Thessalonians there's a warmth there. He talks about them being dear to him. He talks about missing them. He talks about so many things of their personal relationship with him. And he says, no, we were gentle among you. We were gentle as a nursing mother we were. And so he talks in this manner. Later, when he's coming to his final days, it would seem, in 2 Timothy, when he writes to Timothy, his good old friend, from many years of service together, he writes to him and he says, Timothy, remember this, the servant of the Lord must not strive. Don't go looking for fights. They'll come to you. Don't go looking just to make a point. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle. Apt to teach, and able to win those that not only oppose you, but oppose themselves. There will be times, Timothy, when you will talk to people, and it'll be like talking to a brick wall, but you can still win them. That's what that Spirit does. It can still win them. It might seem like water upon a duck's back, but the word of God with a servant that is gentle and able to teach, or apt to teach, able to put it into words that people can understand, and able to win those that oppose themselves. I think it was Andrew Bowden put it on, didn't he, in one of his thoughts of this week. To win some, you have to be winsome. I thought it was a really apt thing to do. To win some, you have to be winsome. And Paul said, no, we were gentle among you. We were as a nursing mother. We'll just skip a verse and come back in a moment, but the verse 11, he says we were as a father to you. And so yes, he had that gentleness. But as a father's got a different role, hasn't he? He sees the pathway set before them, and he's thinking of the career and the future ahead. The nursing mother is there to care and to stand by the little one and nurture and build up. But the father's there to lead a way forward. And he says, when we were among you, we were like fathers to you. And so we comforted you. And so we exhorted you and we charged you. That word comforted, as I've said so often, is not there, never mind. It has nothing to do with that at all. That's our westernized, modern day version of being comforted. But comforting means to strengthen. When you were weak, like a father, I strengthened you. When you were down, I exhorted you, I lifted you up. When you were wayward, I pled with you, I charged you, I implored you. And the reason why, verse 12 tells us, doesn't it? That you might walk worthy of God. So Paul, we were bold, we were approved, we were as gentle, we were as a nursing mother, we were as fathers to you. Then we just come back to that verse that we skipped in verse 8. It says this, we were willing to give our lives for you. We were willing to give our lives for you because you were dear to us. His commitment to those around him was unabated. Neil put on a little comment of the chat that he and Carolyn had had with Tom Fagler, that's old pastor and Carol Cooper's friend from the United States. And what was the phrase that you used, Neil? Can you remember?
Rest your time in the lives of others.
There we are. There we are. You want to have a life that's worthwhile? I'm going to take a funeral tomorrow. And the lady was 87 years of age. Never met her in my life. I knew her daughter vaguely. And I'm there taking the funeral tomorrow. And she's invested her time in her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, her great-great-grandchildren. And so many lives I meet today, their lives are just empty shells. They might have the dosh, they might have the cash, they might have everything going for them, they'll have the best car on the drive or in the garage, they got supreme interest and they can travel the world, but their lives are like shells. Because they've just looked after what my mother said. Your best friend, Martin, will be the pound in your pocket. You're wrong, ma'am. It's not the pound in my pocket. It's being involved with people makes the difference. And the character that builds up in our lives. He says this word. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 15, it's a beautiful word. It says this, I will very gladly spend and be spent for you. Now our English word spent, you find it when they make cheese or when they brew beer, ale. They are left with a residue and it's called spent. It means that substance out of which all goodness has been extracted. Roger, you want to know why you felt so tired when you came to retirement? You were spent. Because all goodness had been extracted out of you. People have wondered with Pastor Cooper, when he was so weary at the end, he was spent. Yeah. That's what happens when you involve yourself with people. So very often. You get spent. But Paul is so committed to these people. I will gladly spend and be spent. I'll hold nothing back for you. Because you're dear to us. Yeah. So we read of Paul, he speaks in this term, doesn't he, in some of his letters, follow me as I follow Christ. It's a tremendous example, isn't it, for us, to see what God is able to do in an individual. We were bold, we were approved of God, we were gentle, and as a nursing mother, we were as fathers to you, strengthening you, lifting you up, imploring you, and finally, we were willing to give up our lives for you. Such a character that Paul had, such a full character. And next week we'll find out a little bit more about this relationship that Paul had with these Thessalonian Christians and his great love for them and their love for him.